passed in 1913. And every once in a while I mention that that was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. I'd like to repeal that as well.
In the Fed! In the Fed! In the Fed! In the Fed! In the Fed!
It will come. It will come. If we can't do it quickly, they'll do it to themselves. They'll self-destruct.
Yeah, you can hold it really well.
They have their anniversary coming up. It'll be 100 years old next year. So I think for the 100th anniversary, what we ought to do is repeal the Federal Reserve Act. That'd be a lot of people ask me, why do you talk about this money system all the time and the Federal Reserve and concentrating on sound money and the Constitution? Isn't that so old-fashioned? Well, the founders knew something about this. They suffered through the inflation of the continental dollar. There was total destruction of the continental money, and therefore they didn't want it to happen to us. They wanted to protect us, so they put in the Constitution only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print paper money, and that you don't have authority to start a central bank. So we've sort of violated that a bit. They didn't amend the Constitution, they just totally ignore it. We now today have a unit of account called a Federal Reserve note, and they all sometimes refer to it as a dollar. But if you ask them, define a dollar, they have no idea how to define a dollar. They say, well, it means it's a Federal Reserve note. So they're trying to protect the value of something they don't even know what is, and they can't even define it. Then they wonder why they have a mess in Washington and around the world. The dollar and the money issue is so important because it's 1/2 of everything we transact. Whether you're measuring wages or prices or incomes or interest rates, it's all measured by this dollar that you can't define, and then they wonder how we got into this mess. But the whole problem, starting in 1913, was to establish a growth path for big government. You know, whether it was the income tax. Unfortunately, Jefferson lost the argument at the beginning of our country when he argued we shouldn't even be able to borrow, but we've been able to borrow all this time. So they also then said, well, taxes are limited because the people will rebel. The market limits borrowing because the interest rates will go too high. So that's why we had to have a central bank, because if we come up short, the federal government can always take their bills and their debt and send it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve just prints the money. It sounds good, sounds like a good thing, especially if it works, and it worked for a while. It works for a while until the country gets too much in debt. And even 20, 30 years ago, the debt wasn't that outrageous. But we were a creditor nation. We were on the positive side, even during the Depression. Today, we are the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. And they think the solution is spend more money and print more money. It's virtual insanity to think you can get out of trouble by doing the mistakes that have brought on the trouble. That's why we have to think about monetary policy, listen to the founders, and say, take away the power of the government and the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air to finance war. More on a constitutional issue, but it's also very much of a government issue, government growth issue. Because it accommodates and it hides the bills for a while, governments can grow. So certainly, look at 1913 on. The entitlement system developed, the warmongering developed. Quickly after the Federal Reserve came into effect, they financed World War I. We had the Depression in 1920-21. That depression lasted only 1 year because they weren't compelled by Keynesian economic theory to prolong the agony by propping up all the bad debt. There were no bailouts, so that depression ended a year. But by 1930, when the next depression came, Keynesian economics took over and said, they're too big to fail. We can't let them fail. We have to. We're good managers of the economy. Economic planning works, and we can get out of it. What did they do? They gave us a depression that lasted 17 years. And you'd think that would wake the people up, but it hasn't. They argued the case back then that the reason that we had a depression was because of the gold standard and also because of free markets. Well, that was absolutely wrong, but it was taught in our schools for decades and decades. But right now, the proof is out on the table that their policies have failed. The welfare state, the entitlement system, the inflation system, and the constant wars is a failed system, and it's ruining our country. We have to reverse that direction. To send men and women to Washington that understood the Constitution and promised and lived up to their promise and obeyed the Constitution, we would not have the problems that we have today. Now, if that was the cause of our problem, why wouldn't the solution be make sure we send nobody to Washington, House, Senate, or the presidency that doesn't understand the Constitution, and you believe them when they make a promise that they will obey the Constitution? Government has constantly grown, and therefore the attack on our personal liberties have been constant and steady. The economy now is in shambles because of constant debt, and there's no recognition that the correction for constant debt is liquidation of debt. Get rid of the debt. If you got into trouble and had too much debt, or your business had too much debt, you couldn't have economic growth if your credit ran out unless you got rid of your debt. You'd have to work harder and pay off your debt, get new jobs, or live more cautiously and live within your means. A country that lives over its means for a long time will be destined to live beneath its means, and that is what's happening right now. The country is poorer because everything is based on debt. And this is the reason the middle class is getting smaller, the middle class is getting poorer, and there's another characteristic of what happens when a country destroys its money and power gravitates into a central location like the federal government. The power then takes the value or takes the wealth of the middle class, it's automatically transferred to the wealthy. And this is what's been happening. During the bubble formation, Wall Street and the banks, they did quite well during the housing bubble. And then they got to gambling. They got to gambling with these derivatives, and they got themselves over their head. They went bankrupt. And then they come rushing for help to the government and the Federal Reserve and say that you got to bail us out. We're too big to fail. We're too big to fail. The whole economy is going to come down if you don't help us. So what did they do? The Congress and the Federal Reserve bailed them out. And what happened to the bad debt that should be liquidated? The bad debt was dumped on the people. That is what happened. And the very people that were supposed to be helped with these government programs and easy credits so everybody would have a house, guess what? They lost their jobs and they lost their houses and they're still suffering. Economic planning doesn't work unless it's done by the people, not by the government, the central bank. We have a system today based on entitlements, and it's based on the assumption that some people have a tough time and we have to help them out. And the bleeding hearts say, look, if you don't want to help the people, that means you're heartless, you don't care about people, you're not a humanitarian. But I've come to the conclusion that the humanitarian instincts of almost all people, whether they disagree on solutions, but we have humanitarian instincts that if the humanitarian instinct drives you to say that we are going to have forced redistribution of wealth, guess what? There's not as much wealth. The humanitarian instinct should drive us to the free market, to property rights and sound money and limited government and less war. Then you will help the maximum number of people and you will have the largest, wealthiest middle class under those conditions. Sounds like a good word. It sounds like a right, but the use of the word entitlement today isn't. That means some people believe they're entitled to what you make and earn and produce. But you don't have a right to somebody else's property. But you should have a right and be entitled to keep what you earn. That's what we need.